Hey folks, pursuant to our conversation the other day, here is going to be the lesson that I'm making available for you to watch during my absence. So this is kind of just picking up where we left off the other day in our discussion of macroevolution and speciation. Now, the other day in class, we talked a little bit more about sympatric speciation and some of the ways that we can make that happen. We talked about habitat differentiation, ways in which population might split in how it is dealing with the environment, developing two different adaptive strategies within the same physical zone, and therefore building up unique adaptations around those varying strategies. Most often, when part of the population is exploiting the resource that's new to the environment, and the rest of them aren't. Of course, we can also achieve this by non-random mating, whenever, for whatever reason, new mate preferences develop within the population or some portion of the population, causing the females to differentially prefer certain kinds of males as mates over others, and therefore causing two parallel breeding populations to appear side by side. Now, having discussed that, we also talked a bit about the pace of evolutionary change. We learned that Darwin was wrong in thinking that it was going to be a steady state, but rather that evolution is going to be proceeding in stepwise increments, what Eldridge and Gould called punctuated equilibrium, where you have lengthy periods of relative stasis in which very little evolutionary change happens, and then you're going to have short, rapid periods of fairly high change whenever selective pressure is turned up and the population is facing a significant challenge. So, all right, we got that. We explained how that works. I think you are all in a position to understand by now about the reasons for that. The world is not static. Things change periodically, and as a consequence of that change, we're going to find that you have periods of short, rapid evolution, and then once things stabilize, once the population is pretty much settled around whatever the novel pressure is, you're going to have a lengthy period of time where things pretty much hold steady until something else happens to throw it out of equilibrium. So that's our punctuated equilibrium. Long periods of little change, short periods of fast change. The more intense the selective pressure, the more rapid the change tends to be. Now, we finished the other day saying a few words about extinction and the phenomenon that most organisms confronted with those serious changes in environment fail. That the majority of living things that have ever lived are extinct because more often than not, you're not going to be lucky enough to have someone in your population that has the gene or combination of genes available at that moment in time in order to overcome whatever the environmental threat is. A population confronted with a challenge whose none of its members are up to meeting is a population in trouble. And barring the migration of a useful gene from somewhere else or a change in the selective pressure, a population that's not able to adapt to that change is going to go into decline and eventually become extinct, an entire form of life disappearing from the earth. That extinction event might be associated with adaptive change or it might not. It might be that your extinction event is not a failure to adapt, but rather being outcompeted by something better. It might be that you have a situation in which a portion of your population is adapting. They've developed useful traits. They're meeting the challenge of the threat. Other parts of the population that don't have those qualities are going to be dying off. And therefore, you can end up with a speciation event in which the parent species goes extinct, the original form of the organism vanishes, and a new form, better suited to the environment, is the one that remains. This might happen to the entire population, in which case we've seen anagenesis, replacement of old species with new species. Or it could happen to only a portion of the population, in which case you see cladogenesis, in which parent population remains the same, new species branches off from them. So, one way or another, though, extinction is a phenomenon, and extinction, like speciation, is a thing that doesn't necessarily happen quickly. I mean, you can have cases where this happens very, very rapidly. You can have a sudden destruction of ecosystem. You can have, a planet-killing meteor slamming down or something like that wipes out an entire species in one fell swoop. That's unusual. Much more often than not, you're going to find that extinction unfolds over a number of generations. It's just like selective pressure. Just as selective pressure forces the species to adapt more quickly the more intense the pressure is, The more intense the pressure is that's causing the extinction event, the more rapidly the species will die off. Low pressure might slowly cause the decline of that organism over a long period of time. High pressure might wipe it out in a couple of generations. So just as adaptation is accelerated by intense selective pressure, so is extinction. Now, in the aftermath of our extinction event, let's suppose something's happened, extinction has taken place. We may have gotten a new species out of it, we may not have. But the ecosystem has changed one way or another. Something is gone that was there before. You will find that one extinction event often sets off ripples. It often causes other extinction events to happen as well. Classic example, the KT event that happened 65.5 million years ago. When that meteor slammed into the planet, it didn't just take out the dinosaurs in one fell swoop. What happened is there was first an ecological collapse of plant life, that the debris and dust thrown up into the atmosphere by that meteoritic impact basically plunged our planet into a lengthy nuclear winter of sorts, in which a significant amount of solar energy was being blotted out and the planet became dramatically colder. That drop in temperature killed a lot of plants. In particular, non-flowering plants died off in very large numbers at the end of the KT events. When those plants died, the giant herbivorous dinosaurs that depended on them didn't have enough to feed on, and they died too. And when the big herbivores died off, the big carnivores that fed on them didn't have enough to eat, and they died too. So we find that very often there's going to be a ripple effect like a spider web, that when you touch one part of it, other parts of the web are going to be affected. An extinction event here might actually lead to another extinction event somewhere else. And this is one of those things that we as humans have to be careful about. We might say to ourselves, okay, well, yeah, sure, it's terrific that we've wiped out this problematic organism, or who cares about this ugly bug or whatever, if we drive it to extinction. But we don't necessarily know the problem we're causing. Consider that the pesticides that we are using to wipe out crops, well, indirectly they're going to wipe out crops, but a lot of the pesticides we're using to wipe out insects that eat crops are also taking out honeybees. Take out the honeybees, and a lot of those crops are going to fail. Similarly, we love the idea of making the mosquitoes go extinct, right? Nobody likes mosquitoes, but you know what? Kill off the mosquitoes, and you're going to cause the secondary extinction of a whole lot of bats. And you might say, well, I don't like bats either. Bats are ugly. Why do I care about bats? So I kill off some mosquitoes and I kill some bats. Two birds with one stone, right? Less vampires everywhere. But here's the thing. You kill the mosquitoes, the bats go extinct. You kill the bats, all the other bugs that the bats ate have no feeder right now. And those bugs proliferate like crazy, and they eat our crops. We rely on the bats as part of natural pest control for the foods that we depend upon. Take out the bats, we're not going to have a lot of our food supply. So that all started with the extinction of the mosquito, which on paper sounds like a great idea, until such time as you find out what happens when you take that rung out of the ecological ladder. Now, let's talk about another thing, however. Suppose we have a mass extinction event. Lots and lots of species died really fast. KT event or something like that. A lot of ecological niches are going to open up that weren't open before. There's going to be space in the ecosystem. And this is going to create opportunity for the organisms that survived the crisis. You will find that following a mass extinction event, there is always going to be a rapid appearance of a whole lot of new species in a short period of time. We call that phenomenon adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the rapid appearance of lots of new species. Happens basically for two reasons. One, mass extinction events. Lots of organisms got wiped out in a very short period of time. As a consequence of that, there are lots of empty niches in the ecosystem for the survivors to fill. With lots of possible eco-niches to fulfill, that means that a lot of different kinds of adaptive strategies in the surviving species can succeed. There's not competition. And therefore, a lot of mutations and variations that otherwise might have failed due to competition aren't going to fail. And as such, you're going to find that living species move into the space left in the ecosystem by the ones that died off in our mass extinction events. And when they do that, they tend to diversify rapidly. And a consequence of this is that shortly after your mass extinction event, you get the rapid appearance in the fossil record of a whole lot of novel, uniquely adapted species, filling in gaps in the ecosystem left behind by the things that died off. Following the KT event, the birds, the small mammals, and the flowering plants, which were the primary survivors of that crisis on land, are going to do super well. They're going to move into the space in the ecosystem left behind by the now extinct flying reptiles, left behind by the now mostly extinct dinosaurs, and left behind by the now mostly extinct non-flowering plants. And those things are going to move in and dominate the ecosystem. They're going to diversify rapidly. And we're going to go from the age of reptiles at the end of the Mesozoic to the age of mammals in the Cenozoic really, really swiftly. Today, more than 90% of all plants on Earth are flowering plants. They moved in pretty fast after the KT event when the non-flowering plants largely died off. Likewise, mammals are far and away the most common terrestrial vertebrates. They moved into the niches left when the big reptiles died. That's adaptive radiation, folks. Lots of new species appearing quickly when space opens up in the ecosystem. Now, it doesn't have to require a mass extinction event. There's another way that this can happen. Adaptive radiation can also take place as a consequence of a whole new ecosystem opening up. Organisms moving into a space that previously had nothing like them. This doesn't happen too terribly often, but you do see it from time to time. Consider what happened when life first colonized land. There was nothing alive on the land when the first microbes got there. They had no competition whatsoever, which meant that they spread out like crazy, they diversified quickly into a wide range of niches, and you quickly had a whole lot of microbial life. Later, when plants moved onto land, your first plants were aquatically based, but once they moved into the terrestrial environment, once again, no competition from anything else like them. They're going to spread like crazy. They're going to develop a whole lot of novel adaptive strategies. All those strategies are going to succeed because of lack of competition. And pretty soon, you're going to have a very widely adapted range of plants in this terrestrial environment that didn't have anything like them before. When animals followed plants onto land, same deal. There was nothing like the first animals to come onto land, so they had no competition, and they spread like wildfire. So adaptive radiation can happen whenever you end up with moving into an ecosystem where you got no competition, where there's nothing else like you. We see this happening at kind of a low level, although not really a speciation level, at least not yet, with invasive species. When you get an organism moving into an environment that has nothing else like it, it tends to be very, very successful. I've given the example in here more than once of the foxes that were introduced to Australia to help control the rabbit population. Nothing like either a rabbit or a fox was present in Australia prior to us introducing them, us meaning, white people colonizing Australia in the 1700s. And so as a result, both of them flourished. They both thrived. And they're continuing to thrive. In the fullness of time, although it's not been long enough for us to really see this yet, it's altogether possible we could see the emergence of a wide range of diversely adapted populations of Australian foxes or fox-descended animals related to different eco-niches. If you wind 100,000 years into the future, I'll bet you anything right now that you want, we come back and check in 100,000 years, we'll find that Australia is inhabited by a whole lot of native carnivores descended from those original fox populations, because there's nothing else competing with them that is a significant land predator. Now, when adaptive radiation happens, you get lots of new species happening really, really quickly. They don't always succeed. Sometimes you'll get a very wide range of speciation in a short period of time when there's little competition. But once the environment stabilizes, not all of those variants that you created in a short period of time are going to prove to be equally viable. And as a result, you're going to find that some of what we call species selection ends up happening. Species selection is what you get whenever you've got a wide range of closely related species with sort of similar adaptations, and natural selection begins favoring some variants over others, not within the population, but between populations. We might find, okay, this particular kind of squirrel is better in this environment than that particular kind of squirrel. In an initial burst of adaptive radiation, they both did okay. But now that the environment is stabilized, there's not room for both of them. And one particular kind of squirrel is proving to be better than others. It is very common to find a very bushy lineage whenever new species appear. Something novel shows up, it moves into an ecosystem, and you go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of a sudden a whole bunch of variant species along those same lines are present in that ecosystem. But over time, you're going to get pruning back of the evolutionary tree. And you're going to find that less successful variants are going to die off, leaving behind only a couple or even maybe just one well-adapted species. The best model, if you will, of horse or goat or beetle or whatever else came from that initial burst of adaptive radiation. Look at horses. If you go to the horse exhibit at the Carnegie, they had a family tree of horses as part of it, that you saw that for a lot of the history of the horse, a whole bunch of horse species were alive at once. But only certain ones, the ones that were bigger and that had fewer toes and therefore a more efficient transfer of force between body and ground, those were the ones that succeeded. And so we're going to find species selection is going to lead to some types of those horses dying off, leaving behind only the very well-adapted modern horse that we have left today. This happens to our lineage as well. Go back 2 million years in evolutionary time, and Earth was inhabited by at least 6 kinds of upright walking intelligent ape. Well, over the course of time, those options have been pruned back. Entire genera of upright walking apes are gone. Genus Australopithecus is gone. Genus Paranthropus is gone. Genus Homo is the only one that's left. And genus Homo, moving into the space previously occupied by Australopithecus and Paranthropus, is going to diversify rapidly. You're going to get a lot of different kinds of genus Homo. Homo erectus, and Homo habilis, and Homo ergaster, and Homo heidelbergensis, and other things you probably never heard of. Out of all the dozen or so options of genus Homo, of which at various points in time, several were alive at once, there's now only one left. We are the last of our kind. We're the only member of genus Homo that has emerged from that very large and crowded pack. That is species selection. So pat yourself on the back. You're part of the winning team. One last thing that I wanted to talk about with this macroevolutionary stuff that doesn't really fit in cleanly to anything else we've been saying, and that's a pattern that we observe with it over time. As I indicated when we discussed microevolution, evolutionary change and selection is limited by the raw material that came before. You have to work with the chassis that you previously built. In other words, with the features and structures that existed in the lineage that came before you. That is the foundation. That is the base of whatever you're going to build next. So, considering that, you have to work with the toolkit you've got. And more often than not, that means it is way easier to modify an existing ancestral structure than it is to try to build an entirely new structure from scratch. You will find that when we look at macroevolutionary patterns, it is very common to observe an ancestral structure being repurposed to carry out an entirely new function. That process is called exaptation. E-X-A-P-T-A-T-I-O-N. Exaptation. So exaptation is the basically co-opting of an environmental structure to do a new job. Human anatomy is full of these. Case in point, like your ear canals. You know how your ear canal is connected to your throat, and whenever you get an ear infection, you get a throat infection, and vice versa. You got that eustachian tube that joins the two of them up. In us, that's a useful thing. It helps to equalize pressure on either side of the eardrum, so that the eardrum does not take too much pressure from external or internal changes, and therefore doesn't burst. Do that thing, pop your ears. You can do that. You feel that pop in your ear. You're opening up the eustachian tubes. You're letting air move in there. You're equalizing the air pressure on either side of your eardrum. Especially notice that when you take off in an airplane, you feel the pressure building up. That's why chewing gum helps. It pops, it opens up the eustachian tube, equalizes the pressure on either side. That's a useful adaptive feature. It's not what it was originally for. Your eustachian tubes began as part of your gill system. Your ear canals started off as gill slits, folks. Your ancestor was a fish. All land vertebrates are descended from an aquatic vertebrates. and aquatic vertebrates often have slits that protect their gills, and those slits open into the throats. You look at a fish, it doesn't really have a neck, right? The head is kind of fused with the body. One of the useful adaptations to being a terrestrial animal is the development of an independent head, a head that is on a mobile neck and can move independently of the body for navigating in the environment. Now, that means that when you shift that, when you grow the neck, you're shifting the position of those gill slits. And when you're moving on to land, you don't need gills anymore. But that architecture is still there. That structure, that channel connecting throat to head is still present there, and you can adapt that to a new purpose. You can develop an auditory membrane inside of it, and that tube becomes an airway for balancing the pressure on either side of that membrane. Fishes keep their auditory membranes external, but you as a land-based animal don't want it on the outside of the body where it's going to dry out. So you move it inside, you put it inside the gill slit, you put it in the existing structure, and therefore it's safe. That's exaptation. That's repurposing the ancestral structure, in this case the gill slit, to do an entirely new job, in this case becoming your ear canal. All right. Now, I promised I was going to tie this chapter off by talking about a thing that was a little bit off, but it came up in the course of our discussion. You are a sexually reproducing organism. Most animals are. You combine your DNA with somebody else's DNA, mix them up, create a new organism that got half of its chromosomes from mom and half of its chromosomes from dad. Now, in terms of an evolutionary strategy, keep in mind the whole goal of evolution, right? Get your DNA into the next generation as efficiently as possible. Looked at that way, sexual reproduction seems like a bad idea. Think about it. Sexual reproduction, you got to find a mate. Got to find another organism that can and will mate with you. You have to in some way persuade said mate to mate with you, or otherwise get your gametes into said mate, for example, in the case of spores traveling on the wind. You might be exposed to dangers in the process of this. You might be exposed to the risk of being preyed upon during the vulnerable moments of the mating act. You might run the risk that your pollen gets blown off course and never makes it to the opposite sex. So the act of mating itself can be dangerous. Could get exposed to a disease. The act of mating itself might fail for a lot of reasons. And even if it succeeds, you're only passing on half of your DNA to your offspring instead of 100% of it. Given all that, asexual reproduction kind of sounds like the way to go at an evolutionary level. So we have to ask ourselves the very important question, why sex? Why has sex persisted as an evolutionary strategy? Get your minds out of the gutter to answer this one. It's an entirely parallel question of why is sex enjoyable? And there's actually a wonderful book about that topic called Why is Sex Fun?, examining the evolution of sex and basically why it is a pleasurable activity. The short version is essentially it keeps you doing it, and that means you reproduce and pass your DNA on. But topic for another time. So our question here more is, why has sex persisted in the evolutionary record as a persistent reproductive strategy despite its obvious disadvantages? It has to be conferring an advantage of some kind that we're not seeing that outweighs the damage of losing half of your DNA even when the reproductive event is successful. Turns out there are a couple of reasons why sexual reproduction is helpful. First and foremost, sexual reproduction creates novel combinations of genes. As I said in class the other day, maybe you don't have the mutation that helps you to solve the evolutionary crisis right now. But maybe what you've got is a combination of different genetic factors from mom and dad, which working together allow you to do something they couldn't do. In other words, some of the success of a sexually reproducing species is coming from reshuffling the genes every generation. That thing that costs you half of your genome allows you to enhance your genome with elements inherited from somebody else. Offspring gets useful traits from both parents, and as a result might have a combination of traits that helps it to adapt in the way that neither of its parents could. So that in and of itself confers some selective advantages. We also have the whole concept of the Red Queen. Remember a while back we talked about the notion that a sexually reproducing population has something an asexual population doesn't. It has recessive genes. And that means that a sexually reproducing population can store genes that it's not currently expressing and have them come up again later. A gene that is not useful right now in an asexual population is probably going to be eliminated from the gene pool because those expressing it are going to die off, and it's gone with them. But if a trait is recessive, it can remain around in a sexually reproducing population even if it's not presently helpful. It might mean that occasionally the unfortunate offspring is born expressing the bad trait, but the trait stays in the population as long as there are carriers. And if the environment ever changes in a way that makes that trait useful, hey, you win. It's still around. Sexual reproduction allows you to conserve genes, and therefore conserving variety means a greater chance of weathering an evolutionary storm. Some recessive traits are never going to be useful. There's nothing helpful about Tay-Sachs syndrome. But some recessive traits have very definitive utility in particular environments. Consider the gene for sickle cell resistance, which most Americans don't really think about that as a thing that we need to worry about because malaria is not particularly common here in the United States. But as climate change becomes more and more of a thing, and malaria-causing mosquitoes begin moving further and further north into warmer and warmer environments, a lot of folks might start to feel a little bit lucky that they're a carrier of the sickle cell gene if malaria suddenly becomes a disease we need to worry about in the continental U.S. And use my hypothetical example of the Ice Age, right? The animal with white fur that dies here in western Pennsylvania in a normal spring day today is an animal that in the snowy spring of the Ice Age is going to survive. So the Red Queen gives us a reason that sex is beneficial that otherwise is not readily accounted for. And finally, there's a thing I wanted to mention called Muller's ratchet. Muller's ratchet is dealing with a fundamental problem of asexual reproduction. Namely that asexual populations have no way of dumping bad genes. Let's suppose that I am an asexually reproducing organism. I've developed a mutation of some kind. It's causing a problem for me. One of two things happens. Either I fail to reproduce and that mutation dies with me, or I succeed in reproducing, in which case my offspring have the same problem that I did, because 100% of my DNA is getting passed on, and therefore they have the same genetic disadvantage as me. There's no way to weed out that bad gene except by dying and not reproducing. In other words, you will find that asexual populations have a tendency to accumulate negative mutations over time. We call that Muller's ratchet, named after Johann Muller, the German biologist who first described it. M-U-E-L-L-E-R. Same spelling as the last name of the guy who's probing Trump right now. But Muller's ratchet tells us that over time, it's like a ratcheting mechanism. You will slowly accumulate more and more and more bad genes in your asexual population because there's not a way to get rid of them. Sexually reproducing populations, however, have a mechanism for dumping bad genes. You only pass on half of your DNA when you reproduce, which means that any given bad gene you've got has a 50-50 chance of not being passed on to your offspring. And thereby, a negative gene can potentially be weeded out of the gene pool. There are some other models about why sexual reproduction might be of evolutionary utility, but I've just told you about some of the more prominent ones, some of the reasons that we are most certain about why sex actually has evolutionary benefits that outweigh its apparent drawbacks. All right, feeling good about this? Okay, folks, I've been going on for close to half an hour now, and I sort of feel like maybe this is a good point to call it off. We're finished with the evolution part of the course. A little bit later than I wanted to finish it, but we had some delays and things, and I feel like this is a good time to sort of call this lecture, call it a day, and rather than start launching into plants with only like a little bit of time to spare here and not being able to draw diagrams on the board and stuff, I'd prefer to wait until I'm there in front of you and we can do this. So we're going to end this lecture. We're going to end this unit. Whenever I get back next Monday, we are going to start talking about the kingdom Plantae. So please make sure that you've read the chapters on the syllabus on the origins of plants. The first plant chapters on there, I don't even know what date they are anymore. We're well off the syllabus at this point. I'll figure out how I'm going to catch up somewhere along the way. But we're going to start plants on Monday, the 18th. In the meantime, make sure that you finished the lab assignments that I gave you the other day. Don't forget to check on your fungi. If the lab is locked up, go to the biology department office, find somebody to unlock it for you. If the secretary there says she can't do it, ask if she can call security and have her do it for you. At least take observations for 1 or 2 more days. Make sure you get to Phipps Conservatory and do your observations on the plants there, the plant scavenger hunt that I assigned you. And last but not least, don't forget to look on Blackboard, find the microevolution assignment that I posted there, sort of a take-home quiz. Have that ready to hand in to me on Monday the 18th whenever you get back. Sound good, folks? All right. Hope you have a great rest of the week. I'll see you in a few days.